Hi, and welcome to my channel where I make dishes inspired by some of my favorite video game characters. Today's dish is inspired by Emil from the Nier series. I won't lie, I first was introduced to Emil in Nierautomata, not Replicant, and simply thought he was a kind of silly but endearing character. I could tell he had a lot more to him through his side quests, but it wasn't until I played the original Nier that I finally saw his full character. Emil is such a sweet and tragic character, and he truly made me feel for him and all he had been through with his sister. I cannot imagine being cursed with the horrible power of petrification like he has, and when he changes in appearance from a sweet young boy to his current skeletal form, I sympathized with him so much as I could see being terrified by my new appearance. I love how much he loves and supports his friends and family, and I just wish the best for him at all times. When I think of a dish for Emil, I immediately think of sweets for how sweet he is, and I can't lie, his perfectly spherical head led me to a ball-shaped sweet that is one of my personal favorites. I decided on a cinnamon sugar version of Japanese melon. If you've never had melon, it's essentially a sweet bread with a thin layer of cookie dough on top. It's a wonderful, easy-to-eat treat that I think Emil would love to snack on with his friends, and maybe he would sell some from his car. For the ingredients, we'll split them up into bread dough and then biscuit/cookie dough ingredients. For the bread dough, we'll need bread flour, cake flour, granulated sugar, salt, instant dry yeast, a large egg, whole milk, water, and unsalted butter at room temperature. For the cookie dough, we'll need unsalted butter at room temperature, granulated sugar, a large egg, cake flour, baking powder, cinnamon, and cinnamon sugar for topping. For transparency, I recorded for this recipe twice, as the first time I failed due to using cake flour that was 2 months expired. I wasn't sure if it would still work, but I clearly learned that the recipe was not feasible with the expired flour. So if you see my cake flour looking slightly different in some clips, that's why. The first thing we'll prepare for the recipe is the bread dough. We'll start by combining some of our dry ingredients into a large bowl. We'll use 1 3/4 cup and 2 tablespoons of bread flour, 3 1/2 tablespoons of cake flour, 3 tablespoons of sugar, and 1 teaspoon of salt. Feel free to combine with a whisk, then we'll add some of our wet ingredients. Add in 1 1/4 teaspoon of instant dry yeast and 1 large beaten egg. After that, add in 3 1/2 tablespoons of whole milk and 3 1/2 tablespoons of water, both at around 86 degrees Fahrenheit. The temperature does not need to be exact, as you can be slightly higher or lower, but should generally be warm to help activate the yeast. From there, use a rubber spatula or your hands to mix everything until it starts to transform into a doughy, loose ball. Transfer your dough to a surface and begin to knead. Knead for about 5 to 10 minutes until it starts to become more elastic. If your dough is too wet, feel free to sprinkle a little bread flour, and if it is too dry, feel free to add tiny amounts of water. It was very cold and dry in the air at the time I made these, so a couple times I wet my hands in the sink to help the dough form a little better. After about 10 minutes, press and stretch your dough until it is about 10 inches long. It's time to add our unsalted butter to the dough, which we'll need 2 1/2 tablespoons of. Cut the room temperature butter into small cubes and then place on top of the dough. Roll up the dough and tuck the butter inside, then continue kneading. It is completely normal that this process will be a little messy and sticky. As you knead, the dough will slowly become less wet, and it also will smell delightful to boot. You'll need another 5 to 10 minutes until the dough becomes a nice and silky smooth texture and passes the window pane test. Test by spreading the dough into a thin membrane, and if it tears, knead for a little longer before retesting. Oh, and feel free to make all this process a little easier by using a stand mixer if you have one. Once your dough passes, you'll shape the dough into a large ball and place it into a bowl, seam side down. Cover the bowl with some plastic wrap and let it rise in a warm place that is about 100 degrees Fahrenheit for about 2 hours until it is doubled in size. I usually just warm up my oven for a minute and then turn it off so that some warmth seeps in, just enough to increase the temperature closer to 100 degrees. So you'll have a lot of time to wait for the dough to rise. We'll have to prepare the cookie dough eventually and let it cool, so I'm going to start this first before I take a load off. To begin the cookie dough, we'll grab another large bowl and place 4 tablespoons of unsalted room temperature butter. We'll mix the butter with a rubber spatula until it becomes smooth, and then we'll add a half cup of granulated sugar. Again, we'll mix until the butter and sugar become well blended together. Next, we'll grab a large beaten egg and slowly add a very small amount of egg to the bowl. Make sure to mix until the egg and butter mixture is well combined before adding any more. Repeat this process, adding a small amount of egg and mixing well until you no longer have any egg. Next, we'll add our dry ingredients to the cookie dough. Sift in 1 2/3 cup of cake flour, a half teaspoon of baking powder, and a half teaspoon of cinnamon, and then mix everything with your rubber spatula until the dough is no longer floury. Keep mixing with either your hands or the spatula until you have a nice dough ball. Then you'll want to grab a kitchen scale. We'll weigh the dough ball on the scale and remember what the weight is, as we're going to need to separate the dough into 10 equally weighted dough balls. Of course, the weight does not need to be exact, but the closer they are, the more symmetrical and even all of your rolls will end up being. Once you have 10 equal pieces of cookie dough, roll them into small balls and place onto a cookie sheet lined with parchment paper. We'll cover the cookie sheet with plastic wrap and then place in the refrigerator for at least 10 minutes so that it can harden. Again, after this, we'll have to wait for our bread dough to continue rising to continue the recipe. So once I finished, I had about an hour to spare. Feel free to use this however you'd like. Once your bread dough is finished rising, punch down the center of the dough and transfer it to another surface. Fold the dough into thirds over itself, then again, and flip to keep the seam on the bottom. Shape the dough into a large ball, and again grab your kitchen scale to weigh the bread dough. Just like before, remember that weight as we'll have to split the bread dough into 10 equal parts. Once you have 10 equal pieces, roll each section of bread dough into a nice round ball, keeping the seam side down. Similar to before, you'll also place each ball onto a cookie sheet lined with parchment paper and cover with plastic wrap. From here, we'll let the bread dough rest at room temperature for about 15 minutes. While the bread dough is resting, we'll grab our cookie dough from the fridge. With each ball of cookie dough, we'll flatten them into about 4-inch long circles. You can use your hands or a rolling pin, but the dough will likely be a bit sticky, so if you're using a rolling pin, it might stick unless you use a little bit of flour. I usually like to use my hands mostly to flatten each cookie dough and use a dough scraper to unstick it safely from my counter. If you have extra time after preparing the cookie dough before your bread dough is done, feel free to pop it back into the fridge to harden it again for the next step, but that is not required. So then once your bread is done resting, you'll grab each ball of bread dough and cover it with the flattened cookie dough, leaving the empty spot of dough where the bread seam is. Gently pull the cookie dough to cover the sides. Grab a small plate and pour about 2 or more tablespoons of cinnamon sugar onto it. We'll roll the cookie dough on the cinnamon sugar to coat, and then using a dough scraper or knife, we'll create a crisscross pattern on top of each roll. This crisscross pattern is the standard Melon design, but you could draw Emil's face if you'd like. Make sure to score the pattern into the dough somewhat lightly so that you do not cut too deep into the bread dough itself. You'll repeat this process for all 10 rolls, and then place them back onto your baking sheet, seam side down. We have just one more dough rising section. Again, let your rolls rise at around 100 degrees Fahrenheit for about 50 minutes. Once your rolls are almost done rising, preheat your oven to 350 degrees Fahrenheit to prepare for the final step. We'll place the bread rolls into the oven and bake for about 13 to 15 minutes until the rolls are golden brown. To make sure the rolls are as even as possible, feel free to turn the baking sheet halfway through the process. Once your rolls are done baking, remove from the oven and cover all rolls with a towel for 5 minutes. This part of the process isn't required, but I feel it helps keep the rolls a little less dry. After 5 minutes of cooling, your melon is ready to serve and enjoy. Melon is such a nice, fluffy, buttery, and sweet treat, and the added cinnamon makes it just a little extra special. While melon can be a bit of a long process, I find it kind of relaxing and a fun process, and since I don't make it all that often, it feels extra special when I do. And what I love about a lot of Japanese bread rolls is that they are sweet but not overly so. I think Emil would love melon of any kind, original, chocolate chip, strawberry, or matcha, and I think cinnamon sugar would pass as standards as well. What a perfect delicacy for on the go and to share with his friends. I imagine he'd love to hand these out to people of all kinds in an attempt to make his appearance not so scary, but he'd really wish he could give one to his sister Halua. Over the long years Emil spent alive and alone up to nierautomata, these roles and their sweet memories could keep him going, alongside the lunar tier, of course. The recipe card is in the video description if you'd like a more quick and concise version to give it a try. Like if you want a bite, subscribe for more geeky treats, and comment what foods Emil reminds you of. Thanks for following along.